In this episode, we move into policies and standards, which are some of the most visible parts of governance and certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, CRISC, but also some of the most misunderstood. A brand new learner may hear those terms and imagine binders, documents, or approval workflows that seem far removed from real cybersecurity work. In practice, policies and standards are part of how an organization turns leadership intent into day-to-day expectations that people can actually follow. They help the business decide what must be protected, how consistently important activities should be performed, and how leaders can tell whether the organization is operating inside acceptable boundaries. That is why this topic matters so much in Domain 1. Before an organization can assess risk, choose controls, or explain accountability clearly, it needs a common set of rules and expectations that support those decisions. Without that shared direction, teams often make up their own versions of acceptable behavior, and risk starts to grow quietly through inconsistency rather than through one dramatic failure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A policy is best understood as a formal statement of management intent. It explains what the organization requires, supports, prohibits, or expects in an area that matters to business operations, risk, legal obligations, or strategic priorities. Policies sit at a higher level than daily instructions because they are not meant to describe every tiny action a person takes. Instead, they define the rules, boundaries, and principles that shape how decisions should be made across the organization. In that sense, a policy is not merely a written reminder to behave well. It is a governance tool that helps leadership express what matters and what must be taken seriously. A good policy helps different parts of the organization move in the same direction even when they work on different systems, serve different customers, or face different operational pressures. If one team thinks a control is mandatory and another thinks it is optional, the policy has probably failed to create enough clarity. That failure can become a real risk problem because uncertainty about expectations often leads directly to uneven behavior. A standard is related to a policy, but it serves a more specific purpose. If a policy explains what the organization expects at a high level, a standard helps explain the level of consistency required in order to meet that expectation in practice. Standards narrow variation. They make it easier for different teams to handle important activities in compatible ways rather than inventing separate interpretations that might produce gaps, confusion, or weak control coverage. For a beginner, the easiest way to think about the difference is that policy gives direction while standard gives precision. A policy might say sensitive information must be protected, while a standard helps define what acceptable protection should look like across the enterprise. This matters because organizations often struggle when high-level intent is clear, but daily interpretation is not. Teams may support the policy in principle while applying it in wildly different ways. Standards reduce that drift by giving the organization a common baseline. They do not replace judgment in every case, but they make it easier to see when work is aligned with expectations and when it is starting to move outside them. The relationship between policies and standards becomes much clearer once you see them as part of one larger governance framework. Policies express the organization's position and priorities, while standards help operational teams translate that position into repeatable practice. Both support consistency, but they do it at different levels. A mature organization uses both because broad principles alone are often too vague, and detailed instructions without a higher policy foundation can become disconnected from business purpose. This relationship matters in CRISC because risk management depends on more than just knowing that something is important. People also need a stable way to act on that importance across systems, locations, teams, and vendors. If policies are weak, standards may feel arbitrary or unsupported. If standards are weak, policies may sound admirable but fail to influence daily behavior. Good governance keeps the two connected so that leadership intent, risk appetite, and operational expectations reinforce each other rather than drifting apart. When learners understand this relationship, The topic stops feeling like document management and starts feeling like organizational control in a very practical sense. One reason policies and standards matter so much is that they create consistency in environments where inconsistency can be dangerous. Many business failures happen not because nobody cared, but because different teams made different assumptions about what was acceptable. One group may handle access carefully while another treats it casually. One department may document changes thoroughly while another makes informal adjustments under pressure. One vendor team may review risks carefully while another signs agreements without enough control discussion. These differences often emerge when expectations are not clearly defined or not consistently reinforced. Policies and standards help reduce that risk by giving the organization a shared understanding of required behavior. This is especially important in areas involving sensitive data, critical systems, compliance obligations, vendor relationships, and operational resilience. For a beginner, it helps to think of these documents as a way of reducing uncertainty before a failure occurs. They provide a baseline that makes training easier, oversight more meaningful, and accountability more realistic because people have something clear to point to when asking what should have happened. This topic also becomes easier to understand when you see where policies and standards fit in relation to procedures and guidelines. Policies and standards usually sit above those more detailed forms of direction. Procedures describe how a task is performed in a more step-oriented way, while guidelines often provide recommended approaches where some flexibility remains appropriate. The reason this matters is that organizations need different levels of detail for different purposes. Leadership usually does not need to approve the daily mechanics of every routine task, but it does need to define the expectations that those tasks should support. Policies and standards create that connection. They tell the organization what matters and what level of consistency must exist, while procedures and guidelines help people carry that into daily work. In CRISC terms, this layered structure supports governance because it prevents confusion between executive intent and operational method. It also helps explain why a control environment can become weak even when procedures exist. If the procedures are not grounded in clear policy and standard expectations, they may be locally useful but not truly aligned with enterprise risk priorities. Policies and standards must also reflect organizational strategy, goals, and objectives if they are going to support risk management effectively. A common mistake is treating them like generic templates that can be copied from somewhere else without serious thought about the business. That approach often produces documents that sound professional but do not fit the organization's actual operating model, legal environment, customer expectations, or risk profile. A policy should exist for a reason tied to business need, and a standard should create consistency in a way that supports meaningful outcomes rather than paperwork for its own sake. If a company depends heavily on customer trust, its data handling expectations may need to be especially clear and well supported. If operational continuity is central to the mission, standards around change, access, and resilience may deserve stronger emphasis. CRISC teaches that governance should never float above the business as a generic administrative exercise. Policies and standards work best when they help the organization protect what matters most and pursue its objectives with fewer surprises, fewer unnecessary disputes, and better informed decisions. Ownership is another essential part of this discussion because policies and standards do not manage themselves. Someone must draft them, review them, approve them, maintain them, communicate them, and make sure they still fit the business as conditions change. In a well-governed organization, ownership is visible enough that nobody has to guess who is responsible for keeping expectations current and meaningful. This does not mean one person writes every sentence alone, because many documents benefit from input across legal, operational, technology, security, privacy, and business functions. However, collaboration is not the same as ownership. If everyone contributes but no one is accountable, then outdated language, conflicting requirements, and weak follow-through become more likely. CRISC places great importance on clear accountability, and policies and standards are a perfect example of why. A document may be formally approved once and still become a source of risk if nobody reviews whether it remains useful, understandable, and aligned with new processes, new regulations, or changing business direction. Good ownership helps prevent governance from becoming stale or symbolic. Communication is equally important because a policy that nobody understands or remembers will not meaningfully shape behavior. This is one of the reasons beginners sometimes underestimate the challenge. They assume the hard part is writing the document, when in reality the harder part is often making sure the expectation reaches people in a usable way. Employees need to know what applies to their work, why it matters, and what kind of decisions or behaviors the organization expects from them. Managers need enough clarity to reinforce the right habits and spot gaps early. Supporting teams need to understand how the standards affect design, operations, vendor oversight, or reporting. Good communication does not mean flooding people with long documents and expecting them to absorb everything on their own. It means translating formal governance into practical understanding. A document that reads beautifully but changes nothing in the way people behave has limited value. CRISC encourages a more realistic view, where policy communication is part of control effectiveness, not an afterthought that happens after the real governance work is done. Exceptions are another important part of this topic because mature governance recognizes that not every situation fits perfectly inside a standard approach. There will be cases where a team cannot meet a standard immediately, where a legacy system creates constraints, or where the business must choose between strict consistency and a short-term operational need. The presence of exceptions does not automatically mean governance has failed. What matters is how those exceptions are handled. A weak organization allows exceptions informally, through silence, convenience, or quiet managerial influence. A stronger organization treats exceptions as visible decisions that require review, ownership, timing, justification, and an understanding of the risk created by stepping outside the normal expectation. This is where policy and standard management becomes closely tied to risk management. The document defines the baseline, but governance also needs a disciplined way to decide when that baseline can be adjusted temporarily or permanently. CRISC values that discipline because it prevents exceptions from becoming hidden gaps that accumulate until the standard no longer means what leadership thought it meant. Monitoring and enforcement matter because the mere existence of policies and standards does not prove they are being followed or that they are effective. Leadership needs some way to see whether important expectations are operating in practice and whether failures to follow them are isolated mistakes or signs of a larger control issue. Monitoring can include management review, control testing, issue tracking, audit attention, exception analysis, and observation of recurring process weaknesses. Enforcement should also be understood carefully. In a healthy governance environment, enforcement is not only punishment after the fact. It is also the broader act of making expectations real through oversight, manager attention, corrective action, and visible follow-up when something is ignored or misunderstood. If employees learn that standards are rarely checked and policies are rarely used in decision-making, those documents gradually lose authority. This is one reason CRISC emphasizes governance as a living system. Policies and standards only support risk management when the organization continues to test whether they are current, relevant, understood, and reflected in actual business behavior. Several common misconceptions can weaken an organization's approach to policies and standards. One of the biggest is the belief that more documents automatically mean better governance. In reality, an organization can produce a large pile of formal material and still be poorly governed if the content is unclear, outdated, conflicting, or ignored. Another misconception is that copying a strong-looking template from another environment will solve the problem. Templates can be useful starting points, but they do not replace business understanding. A third misunderstanding is that a document approved by leadership no longer needs attention unless a crisis occurs. That idea is dangerous because business processes, technologies, vendors, laws, and organizational priorities all change over time. Policies and standards need periodic review if they're going to remain useful. For a beginner, this is an important lesson. Governance is not measured by how many files exist in a repository. It is measured by whether the organization has meaningful expectations, whether people understand them, whether they support business goals, and whether leadership can rely on them when making risk decisions under real-world pressure. A simple example makes the topic more concrete. Imagine a company that handles customer financial data across multiple business units. each with its own local technology team. Without a clear policy, one team may focus heavily on convenience for internal users while another emphasizes strict restriction, and both may believe they are acting responsibly. Without standards, the details of access review, retention, and system protection may vary so much that the organization no longer has a reliable way to judge whether exposure is acceptable across the enterprise. A strong policy would state the organization's expectations for protecting sensitive customer information and define the seriousness of that responsibility. Supporting standards would then create a more consistent baseline for how access, handling, storage, and review should occur. Managers could monitor exceptions, leadership could receive meaningful reporting, and teams would spend less time arguing over what responsible behavior means because the governance framework already provides that answer. This is why policies and standards are not just administrative artifacts. They shape how the organization reduces uncertainty before inconsistency becomes a business problem. By the time you step back from this topic, the main lesson should feel very practical. Policies and standards are part of how governance becomes real inside an organization. Policies express management intent and define high-level expectations, while standards narrow variation and create a common operational baseline that supports those expectations. Together, they help align teams, reduce confusion, support accountability, and make risk management more consistent across the business. Their value does not come from their formality alone. It comes from being aligned to business objectives, owned by the right people, communicated clearly, monitored thoughtfully, and treated seriously enough that exceptions and failures are visible rather than hidden. That is why CRISC places this topic inside Domain 1. Before an organization can make mature decisions about risk, it needs a reliable way to tell people what matters, what acceptable behavior looks like, and how leadership expects important activities to be governed. When policies and standards do that well, they become far more than documents. They become part of the control environment that helps the organization operate with greater clarity, discipline, and trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.